And from that understanding, something even more profound begins to reveal itself, because the form of prayer I am describing was never about asking for something in the future. It was about assuming a state of being in the present. Ancient cultures understood this at a visceral level. They did not separate thought from feeling or intention from biology. They knew that the body listens constantly, and it responds not to words alone, but to the emotional truth behind those words. When I study the records left behind in monasteries, temples, and early healing traditions, a pattern emerges again and again. The prayers that worked were not spoken as pleas, they were felt as fact. The person praying would enter the emotional state of healing first, and only then would the body reorganize itself around that signal. This is where modern language often fails us. We talk about hope and belief as if they are abstract ideas. In reality, they are measurable biological forces. Inside the human body, every emotion we experience triggers a cascade of chemical responses. Gratitude, compassion, and love are not poetic concepts. They are specific frequencies of experience that influence heart rhythms, neural coherence, and immune function. When ancient practitioners prayed, they deliberately generated these states before any physical change appeared. Healing followed because the signal was already complete. This is the lost key. Prayer was not about convincing a higher power to intervene. It was about aligning the inner environment of the body with the outcome that was desired. In that alignment, there was no waiting, there was no doubt. The body responded as if the healing had already occurred, because at the level of emotion and belief, it had. Modern science is now catching up to this insight. Research into psychoneuroimmunology shows us that perception directly shapes physiology. What we consistently feel becomes what our cells expect. And what our cells expect, they prepare for. If the dominant emotional signal is fear, the body prepares for survival. If the dominant signal is wholeness, safety, and gratitude, the body prepares for repair. What fascinates me most is that ancient texts never framed this as a miracle. It was described as a natural law. Just as gravity responds when we step off a ledge, biology responds when we step into a coherent emotional state. The lost form of prayer was simply a method for entering that coherence intentionally. This changes how we think about faith. Faith was not blind belief. It was practiced certainty. The person praying felt the relief, the gratitude, and the peace, as if the healing had already taken place. In doing so, they removed the internal conflict that often blocks change. The body cannot move toward healing while the mind is broadcasting uncertainty. I want to pause here because this has direct implications for our daily lives. Most of us have been taught to pray or affirm from a place of lack. We focus on what is wrong. We describe the problem in detail. But the body does not respond to our descriptions. It responds to our state of being. When our inner world remains anchored in struggle, the biology remains there as well. The ancient approach reversed this sequence. First came the emotional experience of the solution. Only then did the physical world reorganize itself. This is not wishful thinking. It is a disciplined inner practice. It requires awareness, emotional regulation, and a willingness to feel something that the external world has not yet confirmed. In my own research and observation, I've seen how difficult this can be for modern minds. We are trained to wait for proof before we feel safe or grateful. Ancient prayer asked us to feel first. That feeling became the proof. The body responded because it recognized the signal as real. There is also an ethical dimension to this practice that is rarely discussed. Because when we understand that our emotional state influences not only our own biology, but the fields around us, responsibility enters the conversation. Prayer was never meant to be passive. It was an act of participation with life itself. As groups gathered in coherent emotional states, the effects amplified. Healing was not confined to individuals. Communities experienced shifts in health, resilience, and even social harmony. This suggests that consciousness is not isolated within the skull. It is relational, it is shared. And prayer in its original form was a technology for synchronizing that shared field. This may sound abstract, but the body experiences it very concretely. Heart rhythms become more ordered, brain waves synchronize, stress hormones decrease, repair mechanisms activate. These are not mystical claims. They are observable physiological changes that occur when emotion, belief, and intention align. What we have lost is not the ability to pray, but the understanding of how prayer works. We replaced embodiment with recitation. We replaced feeling with repetition. And in doing so, we stripped prayer of its biological power. When we reclaim this knowledge, something subtle but profound happens. We stop asking the world to change before we allow ourselves to feel whole. We recognize that the feeling of wholeness is the signal that invites change. This is where ancient wisdom and modern science meet, not in contradiction, but in confirmation. And as I continue to explore this intersection, what becomes increasingly clear is that the next layer of this forgotten practice reveals something even more surprising about the role of memory, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves, because the body does not heal in isolation from who we believe we are. And the moment we begin to question those identities, the entire process of prayer begins to shift in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about healing, as the nervous system listens not only to emotion but to meaning itself. And when meaning changes, perception changes, and when perception changes, biology follows, which is why the most powerful prayers were never spoken aloud but lived internally as an ongoing state. It is an ongoing state rather than a single moment, because the ancient practitioners understood something we are only beginning to rediscover now. The body does not respond to isolated intentions, it responds to identity. What we believe about ourselves moment to moment becomes the framework through which every signal is interpreted. Healing them was not something added to life. It emerged naturally when identity aligned with wholeness. This is where memory enters the picture. The nervous system is constantly scanning for familiarity. It uses the past to predict the future. If pain, illness, or struggle have been present long enough, they can become part of how the body defines normal. In that state, even positive intentions can feel unsafe. The lost form of prayer addressed this directly, not by fighting the past, but by introducing a new internal reference point. Instead of rehearsing what had gone wrong, practitioners would deliberately cultivate the emotional memory of wellness. Sometimes this was done through imagery, sometimes through ritual, sometimes through deep stillness. The key was consistency. Over time, the body learned a new baseline. It began to recognize coherence as familiar and illness as the exception rather than the rule. Modern neuroscience now gives us language for this process. Neural pathways strengthened through repetition. Emotional states practiced regularly become default settings. From this perspective, prayer was a form of neural training. It reshaped the brain by repeatedly activating the circuits associated with safety, gratitude, and completion. What strikes me is how practical this knowledge actually is. It does not require belief in any specific doctrine. It requires understanding how humans are wired. When the inner environment becomes coherent, the outer systems follow, hormones regulate. Inflammation decreases, repair processes resume. The body does what it has always known how to do when it receives the right signals. This also reframes suffering in a very different way. Pain is not a punishment or a failure. It is information that tells us where coherence has been disrupted, often not by the body itself, but by prolonged emotional patterns such as grief, resentment, or fear. The lost form of prayer did not suppress these emotions. It acknowledged them, then gently guided the system into a new state. I often reflect on how radical this approach is compared to our modern habits. We are conditioned to outsource healing. We wait for external validation, diagnoses, or permission to feel better. Ancient prayer reversed that dependency. It taught individuals how to become active participants in their own regulation. This does not mean rejecting medicine or science. It means complementing them with an understanding of consciousness. When both work together, the results can be extraordinary, but without addressing the emotional and perceptual layers, even the best interventions can fall short. Another overlooked aspect of this prayer is time perception. When someone truly enters a state of gratitude for healing, the nervous system stops anticipating threat. In that moment, the body exits survival mode. Resources previously allocated to defense become available for regeneration. Time, in a sense, collapses. The future state is experienced now, and the body responds accordingly. This helps explain reports of rapid or spontaneous healing found in ancient records. These were not violations of natural law. They were expressions of it. When resistance drops and coherence stabilizes, change can occur far more quickly than we expect. But here is the challenge. Our culture reinforces fragmentation. We are taught to doubt our inner experiences. We are rewarded for constant vigilance and control. The lost form of prayer asks us to do the opposite. It asks us to trust the intelligence of the body and the language of emotion. This trust is not naive. It is informed. It is based on the recognition that we are not separate from the systems that sustain us. Consciousness is not an observer of biology. It is an active participant. Every thought carries information. Every feeling carries instruction. As I guide people through this understanding, I notice a common moment of realization. They begin to see that prayer is not something they do occasionally. It is something they are always doing unconsciously. The question is not whether we are praying, but what state we are broadcasting. Worry is a form of prayer. Fear is a form of prayer. Gratitude is a form of prayer. The body responds to all of them with equal precision. Once this becomes clear, responsibility shifts from external forces back to inner awareness. This is not about blame. It is about empowerment. When we understand how deeply our inner world shapes our physical experience, we gain access to choice. We can interrupt patterns. We can introduce new signals. We can practice coherence intentionally. The ancient traditions built entire systems around supporting this practice. Silence, breath, posture, sound, and community were all tools designed to help the nervous system settle into alignment. Prayer was the culmination of these supports, not an isolated act. In modern life, we often try to skip directly to intention without preparing the body. We think our way into prayer instead of feeling our way into it. The lost form reminds us that the body must be included without embodied emotion. Intention remains abstract. As this understanding deepens, another layer begins to emerge, one that is more subtle and perhaps more challenging because it invites us to examine not just how we pray, but why certain outcomes feel permissible to us while others do not, and how deeply held beliefs about worthiness, identity, and limitation quietly shape the emotional states we are able to access. Which means that even when we attempt to feel gratitude or wholeness, parts of us may resist, not because healing is impossible, but because it threatens familiar narratives. And until those narratives are gently brought into awareness, the prayer remains incomplete, suspended between intention and embodiment, waiting for the moment when the story we tell ourselves finally allows the body to accept a new reality as safe enough to become real. And this is where the practice moves beyond technique into a profound exploration of self that continues to unfold as we listen more closely to the signals beneath the signals, where belief itself begins to soften and something deeper prepares to emerge just beyond the edge of conscious awareness. Just beyond the edge of conscious awareness, because beneath every belief there is an emotional contract we made with life, often long before we had language to describe it. The body remembers these contracts, it organizes around them. And when prayer fails to produce change, it is often because a deeper agreement is still active, quietly instructing the nervous system to remain the same. Ancient practitioners understood this layer intuitively. They knew that healing required permission at the level of identity. Before the body could change, the person had to feel safe becoming someone new. This is why prayer was never rushed. It unfolded slowly, allowing the system to acclimate to a different internal reality. I find this especially relevant today because many of us intellectually accept the possibility of healing, yet emotionally remain anchored to stories of limitation. These stories are not flaws. They are survival strategies. At some point, they protected us. But prayer, in its original form, gently invited us to release those strategies when they were no longer needed. This is where compassion becomes essential. You cannot force coherence. You cannot demand healing. The body does not respond to pressure. It responds to safety. The lost form of prayer created safety first through presence, breath, and genuine feeling. Only then did transformation become possible. There is also a humility in this approach that is often missing from modern discussions of manifestation or intention. Ancient prayer did not assume control over life. It assumed partnership. The practitioner aligned with natural processes rather than attempting to override them. Healing was not imposed, it was allowed. This distinction matters. When we try to control outcomes through thought alone, the body often tightens. Control signals threat, allowing signals trust, and trust is one of the most powerful regulators of the nervous system. In a state of trust, the body opens, repair becomes accessible. I have noticed that when people first experience this shift, it feels subtle rather than dramatic. There may not be immediate physical change. Instead, there is a sense of internal quiet. The constant background tension softens. This quiet is not emptiness, it is coherence. It is the system no longer bracing against itself. From that place, prayer becomes less about technique and more about presence. There is nothing to prove, nothing to demand. The emotional state itself becomes the message, and the body, always listening, begins to respond in its own timing. This brings us to another forgotten aspect of ancient prayer: patience. Not passive waiting, but steady embodiment. The practitioner returned to the state again and again, not to make something happen, but to remain aligned. Over time, this alignment reshaped physiology. In contrast, modern culture often treats healing as an event, a breakthrough, a moment. Ancient wisdom treated it as a process of remembering what the body feels like in balance, remembering what safety feels like, remembering wholeness as a lived experience. Memory, in this sense, is not about the past. It is about familiarity. The more often we experience a coherent emotional state, the more familiar it becomes. The nervous system begins to prefer it, and preference shapes behavior, perception, and biology. This is why consistency mattered more than intensity. A gentle daily practice of embodied prayer had more impact than a single dramatic effort. The body learns through repetition. It trusts what is predictable. I want to emphasize that this practice was never about denying pain or pretending everything is fine. Suppression creates fragmentation. Ancient prayer allowed emotion to move. Grief was felt. Fear was acknowledged, but they were not allowed to define the final state. The practitioner moved through these emotions into something deeper: acceptance, gratitude, and connection. Not because it was spiritually correct, but because it was biologically regulating these states, told the body it was safe enough to heal. When we understand this, the divide between science and spirituality begins to dissolve. We are no longer choosing between belief and evidence. We are observing how belief becomes evidence through biological response. This perspective also challenges the idea that healing must always be slow. While patience is important, coherence can accelerate processes dramatically. When resistance drops, systems reorganize efficiently. The body is designed for resilience. Yet even here, ancient wisdom cautioned against obsession with outcomes. The focus remained on alignment, not results. Results were a byproduct. This prevented the practice from becoming another source of stress. As I reflect on all of this, I see how much we have simplified prayer in modern times. We reduced it to words, to requests, to repetition. In doing so, we overlooked the most important element, the state of the one who prays. The lost form of prayer was not spoken to the universe. It was lived within the body. It was a way of inhabiting a different reality internally, long enough for the body to accept it as true. And this brings us to a question that is both simple and challenging. If the body responds to who we believe we are, then what identities are we rehearsing every day without realizing it? What emotional states have become so familiar that they feel like home even when they are painful? Prayer, in its original sense, gently disrupts these unconscious patterns. It introduces choice where there was habit, awareness where there was autopilot. Over time, this changes not only health, but how we relate to life itself. This is why ancient teachings emphasize self-knowledge alongside prayer. Without awareness, practice becomes mechanical. With awareness, every moment becomes an opportunity to realign. As this understanding deepens, it invites us to look beyond healing as a goal and toward coherence as a way of living. Healing becomes a natural expression of that coherence, not something separate from it. And just as this realization begins to settle, another layer quietly emerges, one that asks us to reconsider not only our relationship with our bodies, but with time, intention, and the very nature of causality itself. Because if the emotional state of wholeness can be experienced before physical evidence appears, then the direction of cause and effect may not be as fixed as we assume. And the moment we begin to explore that possibility, the implications for prayer and human potential open into territory that ancient traditions hinted at but rarely explained, leaving us at the threshold of a deeper mystery that continues to unfold as we learn to listen not just to what the body says, but to when it says it and why, and how that timing reshapes everything we think we know about change as the practice moves forward into an even more subtle domain where intention, perception, and reality begin to overlap in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about how transformation truly occurs. In ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about how transformation truly occurs, because when we look closely at time itself, we begin to notice that the body does not experience it the way the mind does. The mind moves linearly, tracking past, present, and future as separate categories. The body, however, responds only to what is happening now. It does not distinguish between an event that is remembered, imagined, or occurring in the present moment. To the nervous system, an emotionally vivid experience is real, regardless of when it appears to happen. This realization was central to the lost form of prayer. Ancient practitioners were not attempting to predict or control the future. They were training the body to experience a desired state now, knowing that biology would follow that signal. In doing so, they bypassed the limitations imposed by linear thinking. From this perspective, prayer becomes less about changing external circumstances and more about changing internal timing. When the body receives the signal of safety, gratitude, or completion, it responds immediately. It does not wait for external confirmation. Healing begins at the moment the signal becomes coherent. Modern physics offers a parallel insight. At the quantum level, observation and outcome are not separate. The way a system is engaged influences how it behaves. While the human body is not a quantum particle, it is governed by similar principles of responsiveness and interaction. Consciousness is not passive, it participates. What fascinates me is how ancient traditions encoded this understanding without scientific language. They used story, symbol, and ritual to guide people into states where time softened. Prayer often took place in environments designed to quiet sensory input. Darkness, silence, rhythm, and repetition all served to reduce cognitive noise, allowing the body to lead. In those spaces, identity itself became fluid. People were no longer defined by illness, status, or history. They entered a different self-concept, one rooted in connection rather than separation. And from that identity, healing was not extraordinary. It was expected. This challenges a deeply ingrained modern belief that change must come from effort. The lost form of prayer suggests something else. It suggests that the most powerful changes arise from alignment rather than force. When the internal state aligns with coherence, the system reorganizes naturally. Effort often signals struggle. Struggle activates survival pathways. Alignment signals safety. Safety activates repair. This distinction alone explains why so many well-intentioned practices fall short. They are approached with tension rather than trust. I see this pattern repeatedly. People try to believe harder, visualize more vividly, or repeat affirmations with increasing urgency. But urgency tells the body that something is wrong. Ancient prayer moved in the opposite direction. It slowed down, it softened. It invited the body to rest into a new pattern. Rest is not inactivity, it is regulation. When the nervous system is regulated, information flows efficiently. Communication between systems improves. The immune response becomes intelligent rather than reactive. Hormonal cycles stabilize. These are not spiritual metaphors, they are physiological realities. Another subtle element of this practice was listening. Prayer was not a monologue, it was a dialogue with the body. Sensations, emotions, and intuitive impressions were all considered forms of feedback. If tension arose, it was acknowledged. If resistance appeared, it was met with curiosity rather than judgment. This listening aspect is often missing today. We focus on output, not reception. We broadcast intentions, but rarely pause to notice how the body responds. Ancient practitioners understood that the body's response was guidance. It revealed where alignment was present and where it was not. Over time, this cultivated a deep internal literacy. People learned the language of their own nervous systems. They recognized the difference between forced positivity and genuine coherence. This discernment protected the practice from becoming superficial. There was also a communal dimension that we rarely consider. Prayer was often practiced in groups, not because numbers impressed a higher power, but because coherence is contagious. When individuals synchronize emotionally, their nervous systems entrain. Regulation spreads. Safety amplifies. In such environments, even those who struggled to access coherence individually could be supported by the field of the group. This is not speculation. We see it today in studies of collective meditation, group therapy, and social regulation. Humans are wired for co-regulation. This understanding reframes healing as a relational process. Even when practiced alone, prayer draws upon a sense of connection to something larger than the isolated self. That sense of connection reduces stress and expands perception. The body responds accordingly. As I reflect on this, I realize how much pressure we place on individuals to heal in isolation. We frame it as a personal responsibility divorced from context. Ancient wisdom recognized that context is everything. Environment, relationship, and meaning all shape biological response. Meaning, in particular, plays a powerful role when healing is experienced as meaningful rather than merely functional. The emotional impact deepens. Gratitude becomes authentic. Commitment strengthens. The practice sustains itself. This is why prayer was often embedded in stories of purpose and belonging. Healing was not just about reducing symptoms, it was about restoring relationship with life. From that perspective, the body had a reason to heal. When meaning is absent, even profound techniques can feel empty. The body senses this disconnect. Alignment weakens. Ancient prayer wove meaning into every aspect of the practice, not as doctrine, but as lived experience. As we bring this understanding into modern life, the challenge is not to replicate ancient rituals, but to recover the principles beneath them. Coherence, embodiment, identity, safety, meaning. These are timeless. The lost form of prayer invites us to reconsider what it means to be human. It suggests that we are not passive recipients of fate. nor omnipotent controllers of reality, but participants in an ongoing dialogue between consciousness and biology. And just as this dialogue becomes clearer, another question naturally arises, one that moves us even deeper into the mystery, because if the body responds to emotionally embodied states before evidence appears, and if identity can be reshaped through consistent inner experience, then what role does intention truly play in shaping events beyond the body itself? And how far does this influence extend into relationships, environments, and collective outcomes? A question that ancient traditions hinted at through stories of shared healing and transformed communities, suggesting that the implications of this lost form of prayer may reach far beyond individual wellness and into the very fabric of how reality organizes itself around coherent human consciousness, opening a doorway that we are only beginning to recognize as the exploration continues into realms where inner alignment and outer change begin to mirror one another in ways that invite a deeper inquiry into what we are actually participating in when we pray, and what becomes possible when that participation is sustained long enough to reveal its next unfolding layer, just as the understanding starts to deepen further into a space that asks not for answer, but for a willingness to remain present with the question itself as it quietly reshapes the way we listen, feel, and perceive what is unfolding next. As it quietly reshapes the way we listen, feel, and perceive what is unfolding next. Because at that point, prayer is no longer an action directed outward, but a quality of attention we bring into every moment. Attention itself becomes the medium through which coherence is sustained. And when attention changes, experience follows. Ancient practitioners understood attention as a form of nourishment. Whatever we consistently attend to grows stronger in the body and the mind. Fear fed fear. Gratitude fed resilience. Wholeness fed healing. This is not metaphorical. Neural circuits strengthen where attention flows. Hormonal patterns stabilize around what is repeatedly emphasized. In the lost form of prayer, attention was trained gently and patiently. It was not forced concentration. It was relaxed awareness anchored in feeling. The practitioner learned to notice subtle shifts inside the body, the softening of breath, the warmth in the chest, the quieting of internal dialogue. These signals were not side effects. They were confirmations that alignment was occurring. This brings us to an often misunderstood idea, surrender. In modern language, surrender can sound like giving up. In ancient prayer, surrender meant releasing resistance. It meant allowing the body to exit the constant loop of control and defense. Only then could deeper regulation take place. Resistance is exhausting. It keeps the nervous system on alert. Even resistance to illness can reinforce the very state we want to leave, because the body hears the struggle more clearly than the intention. Surrender, in contrast, communicates trust, and trust is one of the most potent signals of safety. This does not mean accepting suffering as inevitable. It means accepting the present moment without adding tension to it. From that acceptance, change becomes possible. The paradox is that healing often accelerates when we stop fighting and start listening. Listening, again, becomes central. The body reveals its needs through sensation long before symptoms become severe. Ancient prayer created the space to hear these whispers. Modern life, with its constant stimulation, often drowns them out. As attention deepened, practitioners learned to distinguish between intuition and impulse. Intuition felt calm and spacious. Impulse felt urgent and contracted. Prayer strengthened this discernment, making daily choices more aligned with coherence. Over time, this alignment extended beyond health into relationships, work, and creativity. When the inner state stabilized, external decisions reflected that stability. Life became less reactive, more responsive. This was not accidental. The same principles applied everywhere. This suggests that the lost form of prayer was never limited to healing the body. Healing was simply the most visible outcome. The deeper purpose was integration. Mind, body, emotion, and environment brought into harmony. Integration reduces internal conflict.
And where there is less conflict, energy becomes available. Energy that was once spent managing stress can be redirected toward growth, insight, and connection.
I often think about how fragmented our modern identities have become. We present one version of ourselves to the world, another to our families, another in private. Each version requires maintenance. Each creates tension. Ancient prayer invited coherence across all layers of identity. This coherence did not require perfection. It required honesty, the willingness to feel what is present without judgment. Judgment creates separation. Acceptance creates integration. When acceptance becomes the baseline, prayer no longer feels like a special activity. It becomes woven into daily life. Washing hands, walking, breathing, each becomes an opportunity to return to coherence. This is perhaps the most radical implication of the lost form of prayer. It dissolves the boundary between sacred and ordinary. Healing does not happen only in temples or moments of ritual. It happens wherever awareness meets emotion with sincerity. From this perspective, the question shifts again. Instead of asking, how do I heal? We begin to ask, what state am I practicing right now? Because whatever state we practice, we strengthen. This realization can feel confronting at first. It reveals how often we unconsciously rehearse stress, worry, or self-criticism. But it also opens a door. If these states are practiced, they can be unpracticed. Ancient traditions emphasize gentleness here. Harsh self-monitoring creates more fragmentation. Change occurs through kindness and curiosity, noticing without condemning, redirecting without force. This gentleness is not weakness. It is biological wisdom. The nervous system responds to kindness with openness. Learning accelerates. Patterns shift more easily. As coherence becomes more familiar, the body begins to anticipate it. Stressful events no longer pull the system as far off balance. Recovery becomes faster. Resilience increases. This is one of the clearest signs that the practice is working. At this stage, prayer feels less like effort and more like remembering. Remembering how it feels to be settled inside oneself, remembering a sense of connection that was always present beneath the noise. Connection is key here. Not just connection to others, but connection to life itself. When that connection is felt, isolation dissolves. And isolation is one of the most damaging states for human biology. Ancient prayer cultivated connection deliberately. Through nature, through community, through silence. These were not symbolic choices. They were regulatory environments. The body relaxed into them naturally. Modern research confirms this. Time in nature lowers cortisol. Social connection improves immune response. Silence regulates brain waves. What ancient wisdom framed as sacred, science now measures as therapeutic. This convergence invites a deeper respect for both perspectives. Neither needs to dominate. Together, they offer a more complete understanding of what it means to heal. As I reflect on this integration, I am reminded that the lost form of prayer was never hidden out of malice. It was lost because our way of seeing changed. We became more focused on control than relationship, more focused on outcomes than states. Recovering this practice does not require abandoning modern life. It requires bringing awareness into it, pausing, feeling, choosing coherence when possible. And yet, even as this understanding feels complete, it is not. Because another layer waits beneath it, one that challenges us to consider not only how inner states shape our own lives, but how sustained coherence might influence systems larger than any individual, including families, cultures, and even collective belief structures, suggesting that prayer, when lived as a stable state rather than a momentary act, may quietly participate in shaping shared realities in ways we have not yet fully explored, inviting us to remain open, attentive, and curious as the implications continue to unfold beyond the boundaries of personal healing and into questions about collective consciousness, responsibility, and the subtle ways human awareness may be contributing to patterns we experience as external, a realization that lingers and expands as we continue listening, not rushing to conclusions, but allowing the inquiry itself to guide us forward into the next unfolding insight where the story has not yet finished revealing itself.